My name is Phil Schrader. I'm the Director of Congregational Development, the Office of Congregational Development, and I'm here to speak to you about leadership, but a specific kind of leadership. I started serving the church here in this district some 30 years ago. And one of the first things that happened to me was I had a church that said, we are not going to pay the Interdenominational Cooperative Fund, and we are not going to pay the Black College Fund. So I was young and didn't know that there was a real issue, so my wife and I wrote a check to pay the Black College Fund. And we wrote a check to pay the Interdenominational Cooperative Fund. Two of the guys in the church took me out behind the church, literally out behind the church, to let me know that there was no way that their money was going to go toward those things. It's amazing to me that 30 years later I get to stand before you and talk about leadership. Hit a slide there for me. This is just something fun. My son, who was not born then, turns 24 this Thursday, and my wife made these cookies for him, and I just thought those were worth sharing. So what I really want to talk about is leading toward diversity. Leading toward diversity. I had the privilege of being sent to the Grayson United Methodist Church in Grayson, Georgia. And when you got there, we had a lot of diversity. We had a woman from Cuba and a man from Denmark. That was our diversity. But the community was diverse. The community was much more diverse than the church was. If you came on Monday night to Cub Scouts, you would find diversity. But there was not diversity in our preschool, and there was not diversity on Sunday mornings. And I struggled with that because I wanted to help create a church that was a reflection of the community. I thought that was important. I served in Lowell. Anybody know where Lowell is? Lowell, Georgia. Halfway between Rootville and Whitesburg. I remember I voted for Jesse Jackson in the primaries just to make sure he got a vote in that precinct. Okay? I was a bit of a rebel. But I came down here from Center City, Philadelphia. I married a girl from Louisiana, and I got sent out to rural Georgia, and somehow I didn't match up with the prejudice of the people that I was serving. After I finished at Grayson, one of the people said to me, he said, "You were able to lead us because your prejudice didn't match ours." Because we all prejudge. That's not the same as racism. But we all prejudge. We all prejudge in one way or another. We make decisions about people before we get to know the content of their character. We make decisions about people. We all prejudge. You may have prejudged what it was like to come and hear me speak today. You may already have some preconceptions about what it was like to come and hear me speak. We all prejudge. But racism is a systematic way of using power to hurt others. There are people, we all are prejudiced, but the minority race isn't racist because they don't have the power to hold others down and to use their power. So leading through diversity is all of our responsibility, but is especially the responsibility of the majority. It will be interesting to see what happens as our country moves. I think it's 2040 where there will be no majority. It will be interesting to see that. John, hit another slide there for me. One of our churches out, a new church, Barrow Community Church, has decided that they want to reach their community for Jesus Christ. So they've taken every county in their area, Jackson County, Gwinnett, Barrow, Hall, and Walton, and said, we want to claim these counties for Jesus. But it's not just enough to claim them for Jesus. We have to deal with the racism that has helped some of these counties grow so quickly. Some of the white flight, perhaps, that has helped these counties grow so quickly. I was surprised when I moved out to Gwinnett County as to how diverse it was. There are 800,000 to 1 million people who live in Gwinnett County. And of those people, I think there's a full 30% that were not born in the U.S. One of the largest Korean populations outside of Korea here in North Georgia. Pay attention to me, John. This is my wisdom for the week. It came from one of my devotionals this week. Are you ready? Hit it, click again. The first to apologize is the bravest. If you want to lead well, you have to be willing to apologize. One of the finest men I know in my church at Grayson, I was struggling with a couple. They had left the church for one reason or another, and I was not wanting to go ask them to come back. And he took me aside, put his arm around me, and he said, "You'll be a better leader if you learn to apologize more." And I thought, okay. He said, "You can only apologize for what you've done or how you made someone feel. You might not say, I'm sorry for what I've done, but I'm sorry for what I did made you feel that way." And he sent me out to apologize to these people. It made me a better leader. And so up front, I want to apologize for the ways that I have not led conversations about race in all the places that I've served. Will you accept that apology? I ask your forgiveness. But if we're going to lead into a new and more diverse community, we have to lead the way. The first to forgive is the strongest. So if you forgive me, that makes you stronger. And then the last, and the first to forget is the happiest. The first to forget is the happiest. That was some great wisdom this week from my morning devotional. Let's keep going. These two guys, anybody recognize them? They met in church. 60 years ago this year, they met in church. The younger one, Paul, was going to listen to the older one, John. His band, the Quarrymen, was playing, and Paul wanted a tryout. He listened to John, and John was making up the words, substituting the words to an old blues song to the song that he was singing. And Paul was impressed with that, so impressed that Paul auditioned for the group, and he was an amazing young musician. Remember that left-handed guitarist? Some of you old enough to remember the Beatles? And he was an amazing left-handed guitarist. It was absolutely incredible. And John thought to himself, I can't have him in the group because he will challenge my leadership and challenge my musicianship. Has that ever happened to you? Where you let your own insecurity get in the way of you doing what needed to be done? John did not want such a good musician in the group. He wanted to be in charge. But then he got over himself. And he said to Paul, I'd love for you to join the group. And Paul wouldn't let him off the hook. He waited. He wouldn't say yes. It took him a couple days to say yes. He finally said yes. And 3 years later, they became the Beatles. If you can get over your insecurity, it's possible for you to do things far beyond what you thought or imagined. Leadership brings clarity of purpose and meaning into the organization. Let's keep going, John. Clarity. One of the things I was very clear about in leading the church at Grayson was this. I would tell people when they visited, we lead with grace and not with judgment. If you want a more judgmental church, please go somewhere else. We were clear about that. And we have to be clear, if we're going to be leaders, we have to have clarity about who we are and whose we are. I think that's part of what Ambassador Young was trying to remind us. We have to be clear about what we're willing to give our lives to and to give our lives for. The future of America is younger and more diverse. One of the things our new bishop, Bishop Sue, keeps telling us is the future is younger and more diverse. And if we're going to be ready to face a changing future, we as a church have to get younger and more diverse. And turn to your neighbor and ask them, is our church getting younger? Ask them.
Is our church getting younger?
Is your church getting more diverse? And if the answer is no, change that to not yet. Because we as Christians have the audacity to give thanks for something in advance. Are you with me?
Yes.
We have the audacity to give thanks for something in advance. We have to say not yet. Go back one. Don't leave me yet. Sorry. What she said is we are going to intentionally overinvest in younger people. Now, some of us who are older wonder why they didn't do that when we were younger, right? But we are going to intentionally over-invest in the young. And we are going to intentionally over-invest in diversity. Can I get an amen? Amen. So, we're doing things like this. We're starting a food truck ministry at Tequila United Methodist Church. We've invested in a different way to do ministry. How many of your churches have a food truck?
Not yet.
Not yet. See, there you go. There you go. I like the way you think. Not yet. That's exactly right. They want to reach people where they are. Instead of waiting for people to come to them, they want to go to where people are. We're doing new and innovative things like the food truck and Dinner Church right here. Douglasville First has a dinner church where they take church to their food pantry. Not waiting for the people who come to the food pantry to come in the doors on a Sunday morning. They take church to them. We can't just sit here basking in the water of baptism and come and keep saying to people, come on in, the water's fine. We have got to get out on the shore and do shoreline ministry where people are. Another one of my buddies has a thing called Wing Church down at LaGrange First Methodist. He meets at a wing place on Tuesday nights with people who aren't sure about the church. He's got an agnostic, he's got an atheist, he's got some people who are no longer a part of the church, and they gather together for conversation and for chicken wings. And that's the way he shares with them the gospel. After all the flooding was going on, they made flood buckets. And at the end, he said, let's stand over these flood buckets and say something about our hope for what these people are going to experience when they open the flood buckets. He said, I tricked them into praying, Jonathan. He said, they said a blessing and a prayer over these flood buckets. They didn't know it, but that's what they were doing, saying what they hoped the people would experience when they opened the flood buckets. What I told my church at Grayson was this: if you don't like diversity, you won't like heaven. It's a great line from Rob Bell. If you don't like diversity, you won't like heaven. And they thought that was kind of funny. And then I took it one more level. This is Rob Bell, but this is Phil Schrader. If you don't like diversity, you're probably not going. Can I get a witness? If you don't like diversity, you're probably not going. I got to the Grayson Church, and my son was in the Boy Scouts. And I told you, Scouts was a place where we met diversity. And I met a family that had twins that were born on the same day as my twins. Same year and everything. And they were in scouting together. And I have to repent of this moment in my life because I knew my church was pretty lily white. And I visited with this family, and I hesitated to invite them. That's sin. I hesitated. I forever regret that moment of hesitation. Because I thought to myself, when they come, how's it going to be? What kind of experience is it going to be for them when I invite them to come to this church? I don't know what kind of reception they're going to get. But I repented. I turned back to Zach and Cherie and their family, Stephen, and their daughter, Allie. And I said to them, I said, we'd love to have you come to church sometime. I'm new here. I'd just love for you all to come to visit. They came to visit one time. One of my leaders, she'd been the first woman chair of my church council, took me aside, grabbed me by the arm, and pointed at this large African-American man and said, "Look who is here." My face dropped. I just was so disappointed. I could not believe it. She said, "Look who is here. I cannot believe he is here." And I said, "Becky," she said, "this is terrible. I cannot believe that he's here." And I thought, oh, this is my worst nightmare. And I said, "Becky, I cannot believe of all the people in our church, prejudice would raise its ugly head in you." I said, "You worked for GM. You were the first female chair of our board." She said, "Prejudiced, he's my gynecologist." True story. True story. True story. Stephen Sudler, Dr. Stephen Sudler, they came Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that, and 7 years later, they were there on the Sunday that I left. We began to grow a diverse church because as leaders, we intentionally tried to make the church more and more diverse. We had a room like this. Our contemporary service was in a room like this. And I had a guy who was in charge of ushers and greeters. He and his wife greeted every Sunday. Why? And because it was his calling. He felt called to do that. So every Sunday that he and his wife were in town, the Lovett stood at the door and welcomed people. And then it was time to take the offering. And he would look around that room and try to find someone who didn't look like everybody else. So he'd just walk up and he'd say, you mind being an usher today? It might have been your first Sunday, ma'am. But he would say, do you mind being an usher today? And I would stand there and I'd say, will the ushers please come forward for our morning offering? And we'd have people that celebrated the small diversity we have standing up front. And it was his subtle way of trying to say to the rest of the church, this is what the kingdom of God should look like. And he was a leader who took it into his own hands. He didn't ask me. He just started asking people to serve, to go from being consumers to being producers, because that's what people want. They want meaningful work. They want to do something that makes a difference. And he asked them, and that was the beginning of some of our growth and diversity. And I'll tell you one of the other secrets here in a few minutes. John, this is one of our new churches. It's called The Nett. N-E-T-T. Next slide. We believe in a church that reflects heaven on earth. His goal was to create a church in Gwinnett County that was as diverse as the school. He started in a school that was a quarter black, a quarter white, a quarter Hispanic, and a quarter Asian. Almost a perfect split in those four. I mean, 1 or 2 percentages off. Because he wanted to create a church of, John, next slide, nations experiencing, next slide, transformation together. The N-E-T-T, the net that they cast out to gather people in. He said, we're not fishing looking for a white fish or a black fish or a Latino fish or an Asian fish. We're casting the net. And whatever fish God gives us, that's what we're going to pull in. That's what we're going to pull in. But it was an intentional idea as a leader to create on earth what shall be in heaven. Questions, comments, things you want to say in public? Is this helpful so far? Yes, sir.
The story you were just telling about your church and about that gentleman that helped gather the ushers, that just made me think about my experience in seminary was that on campus we had about 30% of the on-campus population were international students. Mm-hmm. But when I was serving in our chapel, initially what you saw in chapel, the participation in worship didn't reflect that level of diversity.
Yep.
And one of the challenging things is to treat people with dignity,
amen,
and respect, but while at the same time striving for
yes.
this. And so it's a balance of not treating people like a demographic.
Agreed.
Like people. And what I learned from that experience is exactly what you were talking about happening there, is that what we were intentional about was we created a team, a servant team, a leadership team that was intentionally diverse.
Exactly.
And when we were looking at who will participate in leading worship, from whether it's reading, whether it's praying, whether it's singing, whether it's whatever act of worship, we asked the team to draw from, to submit names. And so what we did is we were intentional in putting together the leadership team, but then it was organic out of the spheres of influence that each one of them had, because there was overlap of their spheres of influence, but there was also aspects, there were corners of the community that each one went into that
and was connected with.
It was connected with. And so what I learned from that is that if you're intentional in your leadership, then the rest becomes organic. And so you do get that diversity without it.
But then it starts to snowball.
That's right.
It starts to snowball, but you have to intentionally seek diversity. it often doesn't just happen on its own. People tend to migrate into homogeneous groups. And I didn't mean to say that we treated people as a means to an end.
No.
I wanted them to be an end in themselves, but it was certainly an intentional decision that he made and that our church had to make. We had our first African family. We had a lot of Africans in our area, and our first African family came and visited the church. And after they visited, I went to visit them in their home. And they said this. They said, when we stood up for the greeting, stand and pass the peace, older white women would turn away from us. And my heart just sank. And they said, but there were some people that made such an effort to welcome us, we'll be back. And that is a beautiful thing. But it is not easy for those early adapters, for the people who are the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of that diversity. There are sometimes difficulties. They told the story about one Sunday where their little boy came up and he sat. I mean, you'd think children would be better than this, but he sat down next to another little boy. He was African. The other boy was white. The other boy moved away from him. And he turned to the little boy and he said, "Don't you remember what Dr. King taught us?" And I thought, a little child shall lead us. A little child shall lead us. Nations experiencing transformation together. We are working to reach the diversity of our community. We are working with churches to start Latino ministry. There's a church, Young Harris, in Athens, and this happened very naturally. They had a gym, and the Latino community started playing at the gym, and there were almost more Latinos playing basketball in the gym than there were people in the church. So the people sat down and said, what is God calling us to do? What is God calling us to do? And when they figured out that God was calling them to reach out to those Latinos, they started having conversations with them. There are a few people that spoke Spanish, but then they called the annual conference and said, how can you help us reach this group? And we've helped appoint a pastor there to reach out and to start ministry there with the Latino congregation that had found their way to their campus. Intentionally more diverse. And one Sunday a month, they all meet together, not having separate services because of language. Yes, ma'am.
I think when we talk about diversity,
Yes.
I think it's important to include the culture of the people. Because a lot of time, in my experience with churches in particular, is that you can have a diverse church where, there's whites, there's blacks, there's Latinas, etc. But then, I'll talk about the music. If it is a predominantly white church, the music stays predominantly white, if I can say that.
Well,
and it doesn't recognize the cultural.
Right. The heartbeat of the music of all the people there.
Right.
Yes.
And so you feel like, even if you're a member there, you feel like a guest, you feel like a visitor, because all of you is not included. You're stepping into somebody else's mode, and it doesn't change. And I find it very frustrating.
Yes.
I'm in looking for a church since I've been out here, and it's
Yeah.
not just Georgia, Calvin's, California.
Sure.
And it's frustrating. When I was in California, I was a member of a Free Methodist church called Light and Life.
Yeah.
And then initially, they had that same problem. They played contemporary Christian music, and it was good, but it was not diverse. But over time, it actually became more diverse. So when you attend church there,
Yep.
you might have Chris Tomlin's song, and then the next song is Yolanda Adams. You have Toby Mac, and then the next one is an old gospel song.
Exactly.
So it includes
More eclectic music.
eclectic music, and people feel like this is my church too. This is me. I get to contribute. I get to bring me here.
Exactly.
And I think when we talk about diversity, we need to focus more on what can everybody offer.
Right. And how are all gifts brought to the table? One of the things that I find in a lot of our churches that are beginning to have diversity, you might have diversity on Sunday morning, but when I sit down with their ad council, it's not diverse. And so when you don't have those voices on the worship planning team, either they don't know the other music or they're not open to that other music. And so you have to move people into positions of leadership to affect the conversation. I have to tell you, it's a very different conversation on our cabinet with a woman in charge. Okay? When things come up, you get very different responses when there is a female who is the head of the whole organization. And so I would just say that helping churches not just become diverse in worship, but in their leadership structure is part and parcel of what needs to happen at the same time. But thank you for, because music means so much. I mean, it's just part and parcel of our worship experience. And I will have to admit, the first people who found their way to the Grayson Church were people of an Anglican tradition. So we had Jamaicans and we had Africans who had grown up Anglican and who found that the church, our traditional service, was very much like some of what they had grown up with. And so there was a familiarity that allowed them to feel comfortable and not feel some of all the angst that you felt because of the music. But that was the first group those were the early adopters. Question back there, two of them.
I want to match up with what she's saying, looking at it from the other side. If I'm in a church that wants to respond as she's asking for,
Yep.
how do I go to my leadership and give them the means to get that awareness? How do I get them to understand that it's culturally different, that these are the things you need to be attuned to? You know, what's the method or technique or materials you use to start moving?
Well, you bring people to the table who have those other voices in your community. You ask their advice. You ask people in the community to help us to better understand the community. I would do the same thing with young adults. Too often we decide what people need and try to provide it for them, as opposed to going, and here's a cultural informant for you right here. Okay? And she could help you, if your church is interested, she could help you have those conversations if she'd be interested. Right? So part of using our connection might be a great way to do that and to have people who've got a diversity of experience. We have a pastor here who hasn't been here too long from North Georgia and has experience beyond North Georgia, and he might be able to bring some of his experience from what he experienced in New York and bring that to bear to help be a cultural informant for you. You need cultural informants. Are you familiar with that term? You need someone who understands the culture that you're trying to connect with, who can help you from doing stupid things. Okay? One of my roommates in college was African American. And I remember he'd get up in the morning and he would say that his skin was ashy. And I grew up in a little town in central Pennsylvania and we had one black family. I didn't know what ashy was. I didn't know what nappy was. Okay? Those were not words that I grew up with. And I could look really stupid if I didn't have him helping interpret the culture for me. So whatever culture you're trying to connect with, you need some cultural informants that will help you from doing stupid. Can I get an amen? Amen. But it's not easy. So if you're trying to reach millennials, you need a millennial who can help you from saying stupid stuff. If you're trying to attract the diversity of your community, a conversation partner there to say, this person might not even come to your church, but they can help you from making culturally insensitive comments. Does that make? So getting cultural informants, and we have two guys on the cabinet right now, one who's an older white guy and one who's a younger African American. And the older white guy will turn to Dr. Quincy Brown and say, Quincy, be my cultural informant here because obviously I'm missing something. You with me? Okay? That might be a conversation to have as you leave here today. Introduce yourself to someone and see if they can help you as you go forward. Thank you, John. This is one of our first African American churches to start English as a second language class. We have a lot of churches that have done it, but not very many African American churches. And we helped them start English as a second language because they were in a community with a lot of Latinos. Impact Church down on Sylvan Road, they went out and they put door knockers on all the houses near where they were, and they found out that most of those weren't having any impact because the people didn't speak English. So they did another set of door knockers that were English on one side and Spanish on the other because they had a better sense of who they were serving. Some of the things we're doing to become more diverse, it's amazing. The Korean population in LaGrange, we just helped them buy this building along with the Callaway Foundation. Next, John. They took this room that was a meeting room. It used to be a church. It got converted to something else. And now they've made it into their worship center. And now our Korean Church of LaGrange, keep going. Our Korean Church of LaGrange meets in there, and as we're trying to meet the more diverse population. The struggle, though, is a language barrier. We struggle to increase the diversity because of language barriers. So we still have separate Latino worship services. We still have separate Korean services because of a language barrier, not because of want or desire to worship together, but because of language barriers. And so we're also creating additional opportunities. Keep going. This is the Korean Church of Hamilton Sardis. Here's another one. This is our Korean Church of Noonan. Anybody know we had a huge Korean church in Noonan? Kia, Hyundai. Are you with me? These are the children that these, and the next one is their fun factory. So we're seeking to be more diverse. But I know that churches like that would love to have conversation partners. This guy named Colin Smith, he said this: diverse groups are better. They've done research that diverse groups are better than homogeneous groups at solving complex, non-routine problems. The more different voices you have in the room, the better you can solve problems. Right now, when we just have one group, they get into groupthink and they can't think their way out of their problems. They need more diverse voices. The function of leadership is this: to mobilize people, groups, and organizations and societies to address their toughest problems. And isn't race one of our toughest problems? The function of leadership is to help people address their toughest problems. Turn to your neighbor and ask them, how is our church helping people address their toughest problems? Not yet. Did I hear not yet? This is the church at Grayson, and I like this picture because this is torn down to nothing. All the carpet is taken out. And if you're going to lead into the future, a more young and diverse future, hit the next button, you have to go below the surface and confront your own preferences. Let me say that. I'm not to prejudice yet. I'm to preferences. I dealt with a church yesterday, not in our conference. I was at a church yesterday who is addicted to their own preferences. They would rather do the old line music that they love and die than to reach the children of that community. They're addicted to their preferences. I like what my friend Mike Slaughter says. He says, when you get baptized, you give up your preferences. That's why I love that he said that racism is a theological problem. It's a theological problem. Because if we believe we give up our preferences, then we have to begin to do things differently. To move beyond our preferences is to move into our prejudices, those things that we do to prejudge. And like I said, we all prejudge. Prejudging is part of human nature, isn't it? But that is not the same as racism. Racism uses power to keep people down and to exclude people. And it's a different thing. And some people don't like to hear those differences, but they need to. We all do. And this is another one of my wife's cookie pictures. These are her Easter pictures. But what I want to talk about for a minute is what happens before they become butterflies. What happens, you remember caterpillars, right? Caterpillars, they come and they weave a cocoon, right? A chrysalis, if you will. And they weave that, and I always thought, it just kind of moved the parts around, and after they moved the parts around, they come out as a butterfly, right? But what we know scientifically right now is there is a period of time where if you open that chrysalis, it's goo. It's messy. And going from one way of living to new life goes through that period of goo. My wife said middle school is like that. Middle school is that gooey period where kids' arms are longer than their bodies and they're just awkward. Y'all remember that? Middle school is the human period of goo, where we're not exactly sure what we're going to be. Little kids all kind of look alike. Adults, you kind of get, high schoolers kind of look alike. But middle school is the goo. And so as you seek to be more reflective of your community, which is really what I think we're all called to be, as you seek to be more reflective of your community, you just don't end up like a pretty butterfly. There is going to be some goo. There's going to be some difficult time. There's going to be some pushback. And what leadership needs is the strength and the courage to get their identity from God and not from whatever noise is in the system. Are you with me? And it is not an easy thing. But leaders have to be calm in the storm. If you want to write a word down, it's more than one word. It's a compound word and a second word. Leaders need to be a non-anxious presence. Leaders need to be a non-anxious presence. Sometimes, Jake, I'll just put a little angel coin in my pocket. And I know I'm going into a difficult meeting. And I have decided in advance the kind of things I'm going to say. But sometimes in the heat of the moment, you forget who you are. Paul said, I do not do the things that I want to do, but sometimes I do the very things that I hate. So I hold on to that angel coin as a reminder of the decision that I've made before I go into that room, hoping that I can be a more non-anxious presence. Leadership is a non-anxious presence in the midst of the storm. Jesus, in the midst of the storm, says, peace be still. Peace be still. A non-anxious presence. This is our house. We finally sold it after 8 months. We took quite a bath on selling our house. My mother lived with us for 16 years. She lived in half the house. We lived in the other half of the house. And under there, you can't really see it, but it says homeowners associations. Can you kind of see that? You see that? I can trace the diversity of the Grayson Church to having homeowners associations meet in the church. We said to the community, if your homeowners association needs a place to meet, please come meet at the church. And my trustees said, well, they need to pay something. And I said to them, I don't often quote the Book of Discipline, but the Book of Discipline gives me the power as the pastor to decide who can and cannot meet here. And I'm going to play the discipline card. Don't play it too often. But I'm going to play the discipline card and say, no, we're not going to make them pay. No, we're not going to give them canned goods, make them bring a canned good. We're going to open the doors wide, and every time they meet here, we are going to be here to welcome them with open arms. And someone from the church is going to stand up and say, we're so glad to have you all here today. And we know homeowners associations can get heated. So whether you're religious or not, remember that you're in the house of God and to hold your temper. If you are religious at all or are seeking community or want to make a difference in this community, we would like you to consider visiting us and just trying it out. Come and see if it's something worth being a part of. We're here every Sunday at 8:30, 9:30, 9, and 11. And we want to be as diverse as our community. Would you give us the privilege of having you come visit some Sunday soon? And they did. And I can tell you, one woman who was Jamaican came. And she had a good experience. And so she brought her son. And she brought her sister. And then she owned a restaurant. And she would tell people in the restaurant about our church. And it grew and it grew and it grew because of one person feeling the love and acceptance of Jesus Christ in that space. It takes one. It takes one person. And she helped me to understand the Jamaican community so that I could do a better job of being in ministry with them. But she was my biggest evangelist. And it was because of the Homeowners Association. I have a friend, I try to tell people, if you have people in your community that need a place to meet, let them meet where at your church? Where? In the sanctuary. Why, Jake? That's where you worship. It is a hard thing for people who hadn't been in church in a while to come into a sanctuary for the first time. We forget it. Many of us have been doing it our whole lives. We forget how hard it is to make that first visit from the parking lot to the pew. So what I do is we have Weight Watchers. Where do they meet? Because we want them to be used to the sanctuary. We have a homeowners association. Where do they meet? Cub Scouts. We have them meet wherever we worship. You may not have a sanctuary. You may have a different kind of worship space. But wherever we worship, we want them to feel comfortable so they'll consider coming back. It is 5 o'clock. That's all you signed on for. I appreciate your time and attention. I hope I said something worthy of you remembering. And it is my prayer that we continue to grow more and more diverse churches so that our churches look more like our schools and more like our community. As leaders, we need to repent and ask forgiveness for the things we have not yet done. And ask God's strength to do those things that are beyond our strength. Bless you. Go in peace and not to pieces.